Hello and welcome to Play It Again, a podcast about books, music, movies, art, and about how culture shapes us. My name is Pragya Tiwari.
And I'm Raja Sen.
And today, for this episode, we sat down with Aatish Taseer. Aatish is a writer and journalist who has authored many books of fiction and non-fiction and contributed to some of the leading publications from around the world. Born in the UK and raised in India, Aatish now lives in New York after the Indian government unceremoniously took away his overseas citizenship of the country. His latest book responds to this exile and is called Return to Self. In this book, he documents travels undertaken during the exile to different parts of the world, reclaiming his cosmopolitanism that he says had lost its vigor in his bid to belong in India. Part of his cosmopolitanism is the breadth of his engagement with culture and reading across silos, which is why we were keen on sitting down with him for this podcast. And what a great chat it was. So Raja, did you enjoy it?
I had a wonderful time. I think it was particularly fascinating how he spoke about the writers that have influenced him, across genres. And, I think we all have, of a certain generation, we are of a certain vintage, and we all have this massive love for Salman Rushdie. I was born the year Midnight Children came out. So for the longest time, my email address was Midnight's Grandson at Yahoo. So he said something about his first encounter, which was under bizarre, really preposterous circumstances with Salman. And he had asked him a question, which I won't spoil it for the listener, but I think that was really the most remarkable thing. And it was the most unlikely thing you can ask a writer like that, but it's also something in a vague way that we can all relate to.
No, I don't think I'll ever forget that story. And that was definitely the highlight of the podcast for me. But I was also struck by the fact I've engaged with Aatish's work. I've reviewed it. I've interviewed him before. I've read pretty much everything he's written. So I didn't expect to be as surprised in a nice way, in an exciting way, by things he was saying as I was and as engaged. So that was wonderful. But also I think for me, it was just utterly fascinating that we got into the meat of Naipaul's influence on him and his extremely complicated relationship with him, both as a writer and as an individual. And I think for me, the pinnacle of that conversation and complexity was when he talks about a personal decision, a very difficult personal decision he made vis-a-vis his personal relationship with V.S. Naipaul. I think that is something that I will keep unpacking in my head for times to come. But I was also fascinated by how, not just in his writing, he talks about how it's taken him a while to break away from the anxiety of Naipaul's influence, but simultaneously, and I agree with that. I don't think he writes like Naipaul anymore, but I think his gaze is still very Naipaulian. But we're not going to, like you said, we're not going to spoil it anymore for our listeners. I think you guys should go and listen to it for yourselves and tell us what you think.
Here's Aatish Taseer.
Welcome, Aatish, and thank you for joining us. Your new book is called Return to Self, and among other things, it's a kind of reframing and revisiting of your own identity post a sort of very seismic event that happened in your life that we will come to in a minute. But this podcast is premised on the idea that culture, which is books and songs and music and art, it forms a very critical layer of our identities and the way we look at the world. So in this context, I'm curious, what would a cross-section of your cultural DNA reveal? The contradictory stands, the high and low culture that informed your early consciousness.
Interesting question. I think it was very, very thin growing up. I felt like there was really a kind of overlay of English schoolboy culture, really. I think that I with Dickens, Thackeray, War, Green, like very, very colonial, with a little bit of Urdu shairi thrown in, perhaps. Nothing Indic, almost nothing. And then a lot of America, like in great waves coming, whether it was He-Man or the Ninja Turtles. And despite all the barriers, by 91, I remember installing the satellite dish and Kamal Sidhu coming in from Hong Kong and that becoming like another thing. But even before that, it was a great afflatus of American culture reaching us even in the 1980s. And and that was very much it.
Okay, so you're saying there was that sort of very cultural, English, the staples that we're all made to read. There was the American culture that is pretty much flattened or connected, depending on your worldview, all of us culturally, that came with the opening up of the economy and the new television channels. And that smattering of Urdu shares that you'll probably hear in, by way of a joke or a flirtation in a Delhi party,
Right.
but so that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, and I remember a few people somehow like there was somebody in my mother's life called Mapu, who's dead now, who was a wonderful textile expert, and his mother was this kind of celebrated beauty of the 30s, photographed by Man Ray, and she had a very deep connection to Hindu culture, and through her, one had a little bit of an intimation of a kind of older past, but it was very, very vague, not formed at all.
And what about movies and music?
Movies was big. Like I remember watching Chitrahar with my grandparents, so movies was big. And then obviously the American films. Music, very much the music of the 1960s. So I would go on like weird, like sort of trip. I have an uncle who's a farmer, and we would go into the hills, and he would like play Bob Dylan, and it was very much it was almost like an introduction to poetry rather than music. It was very profound, and that first feeling for language, I think, came to me through Bob Dylan, and. Yeah, and so the 60s was very much passed down to me. I remember at one point, you know that line in the Leonard Cohen song where he says, "We won't love us like that, but besides, it would still be all right." And I remember like being so struck by that, because even the morality of the 60s was kind of transmitted to me through that line. And my mother kind of just smiled cryptically when I asked her what it meant, but it was like, that, so that there was all of that.
Aatish, Naipaul has been a big influence on your writing, and we'll come to that in a moment. But who are the other writers? You mentioned war, you mentioned growing up on the English diet and the American writers. Who are the writers that made a writer out of you?
So the absolute god of my childhood years was Salman Rushdie, and I had a very strange first meeting with him. He'd used my mother's name, which is an unusual name, Tavleen. It was a coinage, and he'd used it. What she was covering the Punjab trouble, and was in a lot of situations where she was in Black Thunder and Blue Star and all of these kind of military actions in the Golden Temple. And she had this very unusual name, Tavleen Singh, and it had like created a lot of suspicion among the terrorist groups as well as the authorities as to how she was able to get this access and her Sikh heritage. And remember, in the 1980s, like being a Sikh was being like a terrorist. You know, it was the way many Islamic portrayals are today, but Sikhism was very much vilified. And suddenly she gets a notice from the I&B ministry saying, "Oh, in Salman Rushdie's new novel, there's a terrorist who blows up a plane called Tavleen Singh." And so age 7 or 1988, she took me to see him, like imploring him that he take her name out of the book. And he said, "I'm very sorry, I can't help you, but because the book's already in print, but I'll write you an apology for the misuse of your name. But don't worry, it won't be you that'll be in trouble, it'll be me." And 6 months later, he was in hiding, and it made a very, very profound impact on me. I thought, like, wow, like being a writer, because already Rushdie's reputation was like this, was kind of sky high after Midnight's Children and Satanic Verses, and then this other element of danger, which was linked. And there's a very funny coda to this story. It's kind of a sad coda in some ways, because I must have been confused by the intensity of this conversation. And I looked at him and I said, "Are you by any chance Salman, my father?" And he was asking me like, what is this freak show, like coming to see me with this mother and child? Like, And he responded very graciously, but like I think it was part of like my childhood confusions growing up with a single mother, and like getting this kind of intimation of danger from a writer and thinking, wow, that's like I'll add that to the list of firemen and policemen as occupations, you know?
So is it that the danger of the writing world seduced you as much as the books did?
Yeah, that, and perhaps that sense that writers matter, which it was very dimly communicated to me, that I must have felt it as glamour, but when I thought about it, it would have been a sense that writers matter, probably.
Um, Raja said that we come to Naipaul. You've talked a lot and written a lot about Naipaul's influence on you as a writer. And I was wondering about the anatomy of this influence. What is it about Naipaul and his works, his writing, that drew you to him, his words initially? And how did that relationship with his words develop? What attracts you most? Is it his style? Is it his way of looking at the world? Is it his way of cutting really close to the bone when it comes to telling us what he's really looking at? What is the anatomy of this influence?
So it's funny that you asked that. I've been trying to work out the chronology myself, and I think the answer to your question is a kind of searing truth telling of sorts. And I remember very well this moment. I think it's in Wounded Civilization, where there's a dinner in Delhi, and the conversation turns to the rich and the poor, and this woman who Naipaul describes as married to a foreign academic, swinging from vine to vine in the greasy grove of academos, some such like massive put down. And then she looks at him and she says to him, she says, the poor are beautiful. The poor are more beautiful than anyone in this room. And there's this kind of electrifying Napoleon growl, and he says, the poor are not beautiful. The poor are a race apart from the well-to-do. Their bright colors cannot save them. It will take generations to rehabilitate them after the. And it was this feeling of being in India with this sort of tentative faith, which was a kind of glorification or a beautification of poverty that had come down to us from Gandhi and then been absorbed into socialism. And of course, like on some level, one knew one was bandying about a kind of jargon or lies or whatever. But this like moment in Naipaul struck me so hard, because it was on one hand shattering the kind of orthodoxies of my worldview, but also like my first relationship with him was not literary. It was this feeling that here is a man who won't lie, or who will set you free from lies. Because I also thought what was very interesting was that he said it would take generations to rehabilitate them. So there was not this feeling that poverty was a fixed state, that there was a stasis, that it was a kind of something to be, like a kind of purity, but it was something that could be overcome. And I think that Naipaul, that restoration of agency, both on a personal level and as well as a historical level, that feeling that we are not victims of the past, but we are authors of the past, or we can be agents of history, that was very powerful.
Yeah, it's I mean, I obviously wanted to ask you this question also for personal reasons. I'm rereading all of Naipaul for something that I am writing and currently, and I can't understand clearly myself why I'm so drawn to his writing, why it's so essential for me to read him before I write something of substance, which is kind of, long form. While I really admire his ability to, to use his phrase to really see when he's looking and to tell the truth, I also am repulsed by his lack of love and empathy for my people, for my country people. So it's a kind of it's the kind of answer I don't have yet. So I was hoping I can find it in you. But as a follow up to this, Aatish, yeah,
Wait,
sorry.
I just want to say one more thing. It's quite interesting. A lot of people, one of the things they jump to, whether it's among the believers, whether it's the India books, is he was not right about this or that thing. And
Yes.
I think that when you, with Naipaul, what's interesting is that because the judgments are so intensely literary, and because there's so much the judgments of an individual trying by his lights to see as well as he can, the rightness of it almost doesn't matter. You will have to calibrate those judgments, but the actual feeling of observation and of being almost in the atmosphere of a novel, where like it hardly matters whether it's real or not, but you're receiving something through an artistic medium rather than a political or historical medium. And I feel like you can then reckon with it much more easily. Because I've also struggled with this question.
What you just said is just, that really hits the nail on the head. A lot of people dislike Naipaul because they are engaging with the judgments he's making, rather than engaging with how clearly he's being able to see the world and tell his own truth without necessarily claiming that it is the universal truth. And this is the reason why I read Naipaul, because I am, not to say I'm as good, but I'm more a Didion-esque writer. I'm more likely to not say very clearly and assertively what I am thinking in the minute, and why I'm telling you what I'm telling you, and how I want you to look at what I'm looking at. And that is the power I want to draw from Naipaul, to be able to speak clearly without worrying about being wrong.
Right. And remember, a lot of these judgments, he's constantly revisiting in his life. He himself sees them as fallible. And he thought of those books as having 20 years in them, he would say, 20 years. And then he would go back and look again. And I think personally that they've lasted much longer than 20 years, but he himself did not feel he was handing down a judgment that could not be revised or that could not be questioned. I think what you had to feel, though, was that you were in completely safe hands as far as the truth went with him. There was no attempt at falsification from the outside.
So this leads me to this essay you wrote earlier this year in Granta edition titled Dead Friends on Naipaul. And one of the things that I was really deeply struck by is that you, of course, got to know Naipaul. He became a kind of friend to you. And in that sense, his influence pervaded not just your life as a writer, but, your life as an individual as well. But there's a point that you write about in this essay when he offers to mentor you after reading the manuscript of your first book. And you turn this invitation down. And that to me seemed very, very significant, because it got me thinking about how we modulate the influences in our lives. I mean, clearly this is a man whose shadow looms large, but you do turn the invite in that moment, taking agency and control of how you let his influence in. What is it that made you make that decision, and did you ever rethink it?
No, I never rethought it. And sometimes, in a weird way, we always used to joke around. A friend of mine, the writer Karan Mahajan, and I, we would have this question, what would Vidya do? Like, what would Naipaul do? And it was a kind of little test. And I thought, well, would he sit at the feet of some great writer and let him exert so profound an influence, or would he try to be his own man? And to me, the answer was completely clear. But also, I felt that there was, even when you were in his presence, there was that sense of a kind of 800-pound gorilla in the room. And maybe it was my age, or maybe it was just the absolute power of that personality. And I thought, I'm already flooded by his influence. I come from a tradition that's flooded by his influence. Do I really want the man kind of in my head all the time? And again, I remember somebody once at a party in London saying, it's terrible to disappoint Vidya. And this feeling that like he was just somebody like you kind of, every conversation you were, felt like a little bit of a test. It felt like you had to measure up. He was very, you could not use language carelessly around Naipaul because he was always listening, and everything that you said, you had to be in some way responsible for. And all of this just, I felt like he was sort of setting me up a little bit to fall, setting me up to disappoint. Yeah, so that was, it was a kind of a feeling of wanting to preserve my own individuality, which I thought he would have completely valued had he not been in this sort of personal situation. As in, if it had been put to him as an academic point, he would have said, of course, he should go his own way, or he should make, because one of the things he was most suspicious of was influence, and especially the influence of jargon, what he used to call babble. And so one of the first things he told me was, I was going to university in America. He told me not to go. And so my mother looked a little aghast, and she's like, you're telling an 18-year-old not to go to college. And what should he do instead? And Naipaul said, he should go boldly into the world. It was such an absurd thing to say, because how at the age of 18 can you go boldly into the world? But it was, his suspicion of babble was very, very, very acute.
Well, I love this answer. So you turned down the opportunity to be mentored by Naipaul because it was the Naipaulian thing to do. Love
That's
that
right.
answer.
It is fascinating. I mean, you mentioned Naipaul as the 800-pound gorilla, and Salman Rushdie almost as like the literary father you had, so to speak. So, have you ever struggled with what Harold Bloom called the anxiety of influence? Like, how have you dealt with that? Because these writers have had such significant voices.
I think probably every writer does, and I think that there's this there's a wonderful moment in one of the Coetzee books where he talks about the influence of Beckett on him, like that, and about this. There's a process that occurs where you so completely inhale a writer. He kind of enters your soul, and that you're able to sort of do a pastiche of him that is almost faultless. You're able to like imitate him on the page, imitate him. His language kind of becomes yours. And then I, for a long time, struggled that I knew that at some point I'd come close to having that relationship with Naipaul early on. But like, I also was very worried about my own voice. And then it took 2 or 3 books, and then something happens and it breaks. And you've obviously, this has kind of entered you, but you've also, in some totally miraculous way, come to your own voice. And now, like, I remember like early reviews of my books, people would say things like, the trouble with Aatish is that he never writes better than when he's writing like Naipaul. And that used to be quite wounding to me. And nobody says that now. And when I look at the writing, I don't think of it as feeling Naipaulian anymore. And so I think that this, it's a weird way of assimilating, and then something breaks and you find your own way forward, which is, it's really quite mysterious, I feel. I wanted to add a funny aside to this
Please.
Naipaul Rushdie story, which I remember once asking Salman if he was afraid that he lives in New York, and I was like, like a lot of Muslims in New York City, like, do you ever get, nervous getting into a taxi, someone saying something, and he's like, no, actually, people take selfies with me and they're very warm and there's no problem at all. And he's like, only once did I see a man in a camel hair coat looking at me. And then finally he comes up to me and he says, V.S. Naipaul is 10 times the writer you'll ever be. And I was like, well, that's a very literary kind of assault. I mean, it wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but yeah, so that.
That is a brilliant story.
Yeah, really. All right, your book, which I was reading very recently, you write about your exile from India. Your OCI was cancelled because you wrote a Time magazine story, wonderfully titled Divider in Chief, about the Prime Minister of India. And since then, you've been in exile. You don't have access to a simple tourist visa to come and visit your relatives. what do you think makes you an Indian, in whatever sense you define it? And what did you struggle with most in the sense of belonging culturally to India?
Well, I mean, the fact that I'm talking to you, you know, like I don't have any connection to India anymore. I don't even have a tourist visa, but you reached out on your own and other people have. And like that kind of interconnectedness is so fundamental. It's like, of course you have your own idea of yourself, but you are also shaped by how people see you. And it's not a question in your mind that you would come to me when a book was coming out. The book is not even about India, but you see me as an Indian writer because these things are like so fundamental. And so like I feel like I think what the government did to me was that it made me a kind of supplicant, or it started to made me make the case for why I was something. And I think that it's kind of avant la lettre, like there's that feeling that you are that thing. And if the minute you have to articulate it, or you have to, it's like certain freedoms, that I remember with the Bill of Rights, there used to be this contest. They were like, we didn't want to enshrine the Bill of Rights because we never surrendered these freedoms, and so to enshrine them is to admit that they were in some way surrendered. And I think that belonging is like that. It's implicit. It's there because you guys see me as an Indian writer, and because I am an Indian writer. And so I feel like now, in a weird way, where all of that is stripped away, the legality of belonging is almost nothing when it comes to India. It is nothing. And in that moment, it also becomes clear how much one is still that thing, and this book is an interesting exercise in that, because only somebody who has grown up with Indian concerns to do with historical controversy, to do with syncretism, to do with those little fault lines of history that refuse to go quiet and that sort of have repercussions and emanations into the present, could have traveled the way that I have. And I think that probably, like, it's this incredible advantage, but India, the skeletal outline of that Indian framework has been so integral to this book, even as India on the level of content, or India on the level of like actual corporeality, is completely gone.
It's interesting you say this, Aatish, that um, on the one hand, belonging is so simple, right? Like you could have simply stopped your answer at saying, what makes me Indian is that you think that this is a book you need to talk about on your podcast and you're sitting in New Delhi. And this book isn't about India in the literal sense of the word. So in one sense, belonging is so simple. But on the other hand, belonging, particularly in India, is so complex and so exhausting. And you write about this. You write about living in Delhi and trying to make sense of the complete disconnect between where I'm sitting, this area of Delhi, and the Delhi homes that you frequented and I frequent, and the complete disconnect you feel from your own country when you're sitting in some of these homes and in the company that is our company, and how in struggling to understand your own connection with India while you were living in India, you had to kind of minimize um, other aspects of your identity, which you are now feeling free to explore, starting with this book, and hence return to self. And one of the things that you did as a response to this kind of identity crisis, if you will, that you felt in India, was you immersed yourself in learning Indic languages. You learned Sanskrit, you also learned Urdu, you translated Manto into English, right? You started kind of really looking at language as the entry point to an India that, to use Gandhi's phrase, we are foreigners in, in many senses. I'm curious to know, when the world of Sanskrit and the world of Urdu opened up to you, what kind of new influences came into your life as a writer, cultural influences, and what kind of new ideas did you feel and perspectives did you feel that you were now free to explore?
It's a very, very interesting question, because on one hand, I don't think I can deny that the pressure that one feels in India is that pressure of authenticity. One has to always kind of measure up, or and it's a Sisyphean task, because actually you'll never really completely measure up, in a sense. Many kinds of breakages have occurred in our history that have set us one of the tensions that comes up in this book a lot is the tension of gaze, of seeing and being seen, and of being remade by the act of seeing, and that feeling of that there are many moments, both in Mexico as well as in Spain, where the act of gaze has kind of like created fracture, like the meeting of the Spanish in Mexico shattered the instinctive world of a society, and what Paz calls unified the history of the world. Suddenly there was global history, because the world had been unified by this act of encounter. And so this is kind of like something that's very central to this book, and one of the things that I had to reckon with in what I can describe to you as these weird quests of feeling more authentic in India was you also encountered limits of hard rock, where you actually could not go past it. So, for instance, the classical past of India, it was very powerful to learn about, but it was not something that could be re-entered. And I think that sometimes in the politics of India today, there's this wish to be as if unmolested by the gaze of the outsider. And that can never really happen. We've been remade by our vision or being remade by these encounters. And so I think so I offer this to you in the sense that I was very nourished by reading Manto, by translating Manto. I was very nourished by my work with Indian languages, especially with Sanskrit, and I had it sort of expanded my idea of the Indian past, but it also showed me that I couldn't I couldn't go back to a time of purity, of historical purity, that was an illusion. Does that make sense?
It makes all the sense in the world. It's like I was saying this to somebody yesterday, that Nehru's palimpsest quote has the conceit that these are layers. They're still distinguishable layers upon layer, that he talks about. Whereas the nature of who we are is perhaps much more enmeshed and complex. But yeah, it makes complete sense.
It's a little bit like there's that Baldwin at the end of I think Notes of Native Son. He says, the world will never be white again, and what he means by that is that the world, that the white man too, Sartre says, he used to see without being seen, that his gaze was encircling, and now traffic was moving the other way. And so we are also engaged. And so you'll feel this tension now in the United States, where I feel like somebody like Vance represents the anger of being seen, let's say, just as a symbol by somebody like Zoran Mamdani. And like that, so there's this, and there'll be an attempt perhaps to like call him like, oh, little Muhammad. But you're like, well, actually, no, you're dealing with probably something like a foreign aristocracy in your country who is looking at you in ways you don't like to be looked at. And you're feeling a kind of anger arising from that experience. And it's only ever been in the past that brown and black and yellow people felt that anger. And now it's sort of, it's more mutual.
Speaking of this increasingly unwhite world, your new book is also a travelogue. So I was wondering what travel writers have inspired you to be like them or not be like them.
So I very much, people joke here, they always say like, you're like the last travel writer, because apparently white people don't have the the permission to travel anymore. But I actually have, I have many white writers who I regard very highly. I love Rebecca West. I feel like Rebecca West, 100%, despite being English, has tremendous feeling for the things that interest me, which especially like the kind of inner controversy of a society, the things that like that those little nodal points of history. So she's a wonderful writer. I found Paz writing about India was so moving for me because I thought like only a Mexican could have written about India in that way. And that to me was like an act of sympathy that that sort of breaks down the binary of the West and India. Do you know? So I think Amitav Ghosh going to Egypt is a wonderful example of that as well. And actually, I feel like this we have a little bit of a tradition now. We have Ghosh, we have Naipaul, Vikram Seth, Anjan Sundaram in a more recent era. And I think that Indians make wonderful travelers because we have so many points of entry. The Indian diaspora is vast. It gives us access to Africa. It gives us access to the Caribbean. We have suffused Southeast Asia with Indic culture. We are the recipients of Muslim Islamic culture. We've been colonized. We have all these points of entry that make travel very interesting. They allow greater reserves of sympathy. They break down binaries. They make the exercise of writing in this way more complex and layered. And so yeah, so that's kind of the that's sort of my feeling about us in the world.
Do you seek out culture as a means of understanding? Because we talked about language as a portal into a people and a civilization and a culture, but you can't possibly learn all the languages in the world. So, can culture become a stand in, both elite culture, high culture, as well as popular culture, when it comes to trying to really um, understand a place and its people and its history and their way of looking at the world? And do you seek it out in that sense?
I want to understand your question a little bit better. Culture in opposition to what? In the sense, yeah.
So, for example, when you go into a place, you are likely to um, what you'll end up taking note of and writing about most is um, sort of the historical fault lines, the kind of seismic historical events that have shaped a country, a nation, a people, a society. But in preparation, so you might not actually be writing about what cinema they are watching, what they're listening to, but in preparation of going there, in addition to reading books about, say, Uzbekistan, would you also try and engage with what is happening on Uzbeki, everything from what is happening on Uzbeki TikTok to, what is there any contemporary literature coming out of it? So that
Yeah.
whole gamut.
Yeah, very much. And again, these things for me are not separate. So there's a moment in I think a club in Uzbekistan where they're listening 1 minute to like Russian music about like, oh, I've got the hottest ass in the world. My hot ass is the envy of the world. And the next minute they're switching to like Persian songs. They have Uzbeki music. They have Afghan stuff coming in. These things are not for me removed from history. I think what one accepts as one's culture and what one reacts against and the kind of things you stew over, it's very much part of historical reconciliation. So like, in Mexico, for instance, there's this intense need to communicate with a pre-Columbian past or a pre-Hispanic past through food, because food is one of the last vestiges of that culture, because so much of the physical remains of the past have been destroyed. So these become like points of entry for this deeper communion with the past. So it's very enmeshed for me. It's I don't think culture is ever a kind of like it's never a sort of a quiet static sealed off, it's not it's not without incident or without, like to me it's very difficult terrain. What we accept as our culture, what we reject, the appeal of another culture, these things are very tense. They're not they're very much part of history.
And I think you explore this so beautifully in your chapter on perfumes. I think it's just
Right.
perhaps one of my most favorite chapters, and it also kind of pushes the boundary of our understanding of culture and the way, because, you link gender politics and morality and popular culture and, you know, uh, traditional cultures and so on, and fashion, of course, which, is the the kind of nodal point when it comes to what perfumes we're wearing, particularly in the West. So yeah, I think it's just such a beautiful essay.
And again, like, food is culture, and it's so interesting. In that Mexican chapter, you'll see how so much of the things we think of as integral, whether it's potatoes in Russia or tomatoes in the Mediterranean, or chilies or peanuts in Southeast Asia, all of these things are imports. And we live in this age of nativism, and there's so much that we have accepted. And the dinner table is like, usually should be the kind of venue or the locus of the most intense nativist feelings, and yet there's so much that we take for granted in what we've assimilated. And even as we kind of like rehearse certain historical battles, trying to weed out, for instance, foreign words from language, so these things are very like that. It's a very interesting complex of what we've made our own and what we still think of as alien.
This you write about feeling free of the burden to shrink yourself to fit within an increasingly parochial country, of a return to your intrinsic cosmopolitanness. So could you expand on this a little? What is that cosmopolitanness look like to you?
So to me, it looked most like a kind of memory of youth. I was 25 when I traveled for my first book, and I traveled from Istanbul to Mecca and from Mecca to Lahore. And in each of these societies, as a very young person, I was able to go, rent an apartment, start to talk to people, build a narrative. And like, I found that after 10 years of living in India, I had become almost a little afraid of the world. And while I was like fetishizing the Indian past and Indian belonging, I had a relationship, a convulsed relationship with the West. But this great richness of these other countries to which India was so profoundly connected, they had almost become irrelevant to me. They'd ceased to matter. And when this OCI thing happened, it corresponded with this very fruitful relationship I've had with Hanya Yanagihara, the novelist. And she started to send me out into the world. And I was flooded with that feeling of a younger self, and how easy it was for me as an Indian to be at home in the world and to talk to people and to understand, like, and to be in sympathy with people. And I felt like a sense, like almost a small sense of tragedy at how fearful I had become of the world, and fearful, neglectful, all of these things. And I thought, it's so strange in the era that we live in, like, we're in this kind of binary, and we don't sort of like the kind of natural richness of Indian cosmopolitanism. We've kind of closed ourselves off from it. And so that was, I think, the feeling. And it came to me as a feeling rather than a thought. It came to me as a sense of euphoria at being in the world, and of having a way forward as a writer. And I thought, like, I shouldn't do that again. I shouldn't sort of try to sort of accommodate that national feeling to such an extent that it kind of makes me a lesser person.
Aatish, what does the term guilty pleasure mean to you? Do you have any guilty pleasures in the traditional sense of how we use that phrase when it comes to books, movies, music, television
Television.
series?
Yeah, television is a guilty pleasure, but very like high and low culture sort of person. I think in reading, I don't have a low taste. I very much admire the kind of reader my grandmother was such a reader who could like be reading Mills and Boons, and then the next, she could be reading a very serious, important book. But I'm not that kind of reader. I'm I'm a man of high tastes when it comes to books. But in every in every other area, I have many low tastes, and I don't at all like I accept it very easily. I don't have a difficult relationship with it.
So you
There's
can
no
watch
guilt.
it without feeling guilty. There's no guilt.
Yeah, there's no guilt. There's no
So you
guilt.
can sit and binge watch Emily in Paris, and you're not going to feel
I love
slightly
Emily
shitty
in
about yourself.
Paris. I love Emily in Paris.
Absolutely adore Emily in Paris.
I'm
See, I didn't even have
absolutely
to.
traumatized about the recent news about somebody on the set being killed and them canceling the show.
But I've been keeping tabs, and they've resumed the shoot, so we can breathe.
Really? Okay, great. What good news. Thank you for telling me.
Of course.
Appalled by this love for Emily in Paris. But going back to the man of high taste who reads a certain way, has the way you read changed over time? And do you read while you're also writing?
Yeah, it has changed. It's very, it's a weird, it's an odd, like it feels almost like the way that, like it feels like age. It feels like, I don't know, if you find that you're not able to lose weight so easily, or you're not as athletic, or you're not able to sort of deal with a big night of alcohol, or all of these things. Like for me, I've had a corresponding feeling with reading, which is that I was just for many years like reading in a really a kind of deep reading that like would enter me very on. It wasn't just the time I spent reading; it was the way its effect on me. And now I feel like that portal has closed a little bit, and I read a lot in systematic ways, but I don't feel like influence again as profoundly as I used to. I don't feel like the power of reading to change me in the way that it used to, which was that it would enter me almost subliminally, and that reading would become something sort of like, yeah, it was almost like a formation of personality, of a reading personality. And I've tried many times to kind of go back to that, and wondered why it doesn't have the same texture, but it doesn't. It doesn't. I read in systematic, programmatic ways, but not in that way of being flooded by influence.
Is there a piece of work that you feel has been wrongly appraised? Either it doesn't live up to the hype, or it hasn't gotten its due. Now, there might be a couple of things here, but what we're asking is something that makes you feel really riles you up. What would it be?
Not Emily in Paris.
Damn it.
No.
I was hoping that's what you'd say.
I mean, like, since we're on this subject, there are many such works. And again, like, I think that it's a very interesting question for us. Like, I was witness to 50 years of Area of Darkness, and every now and then in India we have these like little parties for like, I don't know, 10 years of Shadow Lines or something like that. And it was 50 years of Area of Darkness, and I can't think of a work that has had a more profound effect on Indian intellectual life than Area of Darkness. And I saw Girish Karnad going from television show to television show denouncing Naipaul. And I was like, wow, like this is 50 years on, and India is still not able to see that, like, whatever you think about this work, it's had a profound like effect on your intellectual life, and there has to be a reckoning that goes beyond vilification or denunciation. And it made me feel that like there was still a kind of infantile quality about our intellectual life that we were not able to sort of to do a deeper appraisal. And so and I also thought, I was like, wow, like I guess this is the figure of the writer, where that sense of Camus, like, cries of hatred meeting me at the gallows. Like I was like, wow, he's gonna die soon. He died 6 years later, and he never really lived to see that sense of appreciation or having mattered. And I think that one has to wonder what it is about our intellectual life that still makes us so reactionary, so rigid, so unable to take the long view.
And so susceptible to false dichotomies as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You keep coming back to the impact of the writer and, how the writer matters, which obviously is a question that fascinates us all. But the first time you and I interacted, Aatish, the only real time we really went back and forth was when Salman Rushdie had been stabbed. And you were very kindly DMing me dispatches, letting me know that he was fine because there was,
Right.
we were all panicked and we were all scared. How do you think social media has changed or influenced your cultural diet, the way you consume?
I feel like the fever has broken. I think there was a moment where I felt like the power of the addiction, the power of like like having inflamed emotions all the time. But I was never a Facebook man. I find X completely like inert now. And I find Instagram like pretty light and pleasurable to me. So I feel in some ways that, and I more and more when I meet young people, I feel like they're much more able to find the right place for social media in their life. And actually, it's often the case with much older people where I feel like they're really like still a little bit convulsed, still a little bit unable to tell truth from fiction, or and not able to navigate it, and kind of a little bit sort of swept up by it. But I for my part feel like not so much acted upon by social media anymore.
I guess as a follow-up question, when I think we were asking this question, one of the things that we were also thinking about is the way in the role of algorithms in what comes to us and what is being recommended to us, and our vulnerability to curiosity about it, right? So, have in as a follow up to this, I'd like to ask you that where are you getting your recommendations from today the most when it comes to what you want to read next or what you want to watch next?
Uh, Probably very much word of mouth for television. Like that's still a very powerful thing for me. And then there's quite a lot of surprising stuff, like there's this writer Larry McMurtry who wrote a book called A Lonesome Dove, big Texas novel, and he's had a like a TikTok like revival. And so I met like somebody very young the other day who was reading Larry McMurtry, and I was like, oh wow, like how come? And they were like, there's this sort of need I feel now in among younger people to like find things on their own. Like I think that the algorithm, of course, is like a massive mediator, but I think that what's broken down is like uh uh is the critical complex, the complex of people telling you what you should read, what you shouldn't, appraisal, prizes. I feel like all of that's like a little bit more diminished. Um, and I mean, I'll give you an example from my own life. This writer Hania, who I work with, um, her book A Little Life was actually like, it was quite soundly attacked by the establishment when it came out, but it was this intense word of mouth success. And I remember saying, like, I was like, how are you upset that 1,000-page novel of literary quality is like being inhaled by people and all around, and it's this word of mouth success and continues to be like a kind of catch-22 book. And so I think it was a moment where a new way of coming to stuff was clashing with the old curatorial instinct, the desire to tell people what they should look at, what they shouldn't look at, appraisal, really. I think that's broken down.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end. And speaking of recommendations in this segment, what we do is we talk about a piece of art, book, movie that reminds us of your work. It may be something that you have already read or watched, or you may not have, but it's our recommendation in any case. Raja, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about a travel book that is one of my favorites just because of its really unique lens. And I think you might enjoy this if you haven't already read it. It's this book by P.J. O'Rourke called Holidays in Hell, where he goes to various war-torn places, destroyed places. He goes to Lebanon, goes to the Gaza Strip, goes all over the place, and writes about them as if writing a tourist book. So he talks about, for example, my favorite chapter is one where he's talking about Beirut, and he talks about the one of the hotels where they still have water skiing, and he's asking the person that are there snipers still around when you're skiing? What are the best hours, or which side of the swimming pool to stay in for cheaper, so because you have a lesser chance of gunfire. So it's really quite brilliant like that, because even though it's a very glib and funny lens, it brings its own truths into it, because you just wouldn't question that world with this gaze, and it is really unique, and it's a book that stayed with me a while, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. I haven't read it. I look forward to it.
This was a tougher task for me because I think um, you're one of those few writers who I've read absolutely everything you've written. So I had a very long list that I had to kind of then whittle down. I'm going to keep this short. There are two films, and it's hard for me to say exactly why I thought of them in the context of your work, but I think there is a connection somewhere. One is a film that came out last year called A Real Pain, directed by Jesse Eisenberg, and starring Jesse Eisenberg as well, and Kieran Culkin. It's about these two mismatched cousins who take on a Jewish heritage tour in Poland in memory of their beloved dead grandmother. And it brings up these questions. It's a comedy, but it brings up these questions about what we seek when we travel and the way in which um, travel can alter our relationship with our own personal identity and understanding of history. So perhaps that is why, but I thought of that movie in the context of your work. The more unlikely film is something I watched actually day before yesterday, and it's called Hot Milk. It's based on a novel by Deborah Levy. And it's entirely about this mother and daughter duo who take a holiday in Europe. Um, and it's a very intimate, very Spartan kind of film. But I think something about um, trying to square and really get to the bottom of the myriad ways in which um, we're paying off the debts of our families and our relationship with our parents and how they inform who we become made me think of some of your essays. And finally, obviously, I mean, Vile Bodies, and this is in the context to novels, your Delhi novels. Of course, Vile Bodies, Rich Like Us, all of that. I'm sure you've read all of those. But there is a play, and I was wondering if you've read it. It's by Mahesh Elkunchwar, and it's called Party, which was also made into a film by Govind Nihalani. And I absolutely adore that play. It's an elite theater party in which these conversations are going on between um, the sort of intellectual elite in Mumbai. Well, he based it in Pune, but the film is based in Mumbai. And I adore that play, and I've often thought of it in the context of your Delhi novels.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Those are some really nice recommendations and actually all new to me.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that. It was very hard for me to find something that was not completely wasted, because I was sure you'd have come across it in some way or the other. But thank you for doing this, Aatish. Thank you for making the time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Aatish.
Lovely to speak to you both.
That's all from this episode. Thank you for listening. Please take a minute to support us by liking, subscribing, and sharing this. It'll mean a lot to us. See you soon again.